Chosen one. Your circle is shrinking. The invitations have stopped. People who were once close have quietly drifted. No argument, no explanation, no goodbye. And instead of feeling relieved, you're asking yourself, did I do something wrong? Before you spend another moment turning that question over, stop. What you're experiencing isn't the failure of your relationships. It isn't rejection dressed up as distance. It's a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Pay attention. Here's the thing. The world gave you a very specific framework for this kind of experience. It said, connection is currency. The more people around you, the more valuable you are. If your calendar is full, you're doing something right. If your table is empty, you've failed at something important. That framework isn't neutral, it's actively working against you. Not because it's wrong for everyone, but because it was never designed for the kind of person you're in the process of becoming. Stay with me. There's a question I want you to hold before we go any further. Have you ever walked into a room full of people, a gathering you felt you should want to be at, and felt yourself getting smaller, not quieter, smaller, like something essential was quietly leaving you with every conversation you held, every smile you performed, every version of yourself you adjusted to fit the space? That's not introversion, that's not anxiety, that's a signal. And the fact that you've been apologizing for it or trying to fix it by pushing yourself into more rooms, that's exactly what we need to address. Here's what nobody tells you. There's a real difference between a person who can't connect and a person who's been calibrated to sense what others can't. One is struggling, the other is being prepared. And from the inside, preparation and failure can look almost identical. Think about that. The two experiences share the same surface, the quiet evenings, the shrinking calendar, the sense that something has fundamentally shifted, but they don't share the same meaning. And meaning is everything when you're trying to decide whether to fight what's happening or move with it. The gardener doesn't explain the pruning to the branch. The branch only feels the cut. It doesn't know why the growth it worked so hard to build is being removed. It doesn't understand that the weight it was carrying was actually competing with what was meant to come in. It only knows something changed. Something is gone. The tree looks smaller now, but the gardener isn't reducing the tree. The gardener is focusing it. That's a completely different operation, and it requires a completely different response from you. What you're living through has a name. It's called the pruning. And it isn't happening randomly. It isn't punishment for something you did wrong, and it isn't a signal that you should have tried harder, been more available, or said yes more often. It's a precision process. Precision doesn't happen in noise, it happens in deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable reduction. The people who exit your life without explanation aren't failures of your character. They're evidence that the ground is being cleared. Now watch this. When soil is being prepared for a serious harvest, it doesn't look productive. It looks stripped. It looks like less. A farmer who doesn't understand the season might panic. The field looks worse than before. Nothing is growing. Everything that was there is now gone. But the farmer who knows the process understands this is exactly what has to happen before anything significant can take root. You're in that field right now, not abandoned, not shrinking, being prepared. Let that land. This isn't a message about how special you are. That's not what you need right now. What you need is clarity, because confusion is expensive. It's costing you peace. It's costing you the ability to move with intention through something that is actually purposeful. So here's the foundation. Everything else builds on what you're experiencing: the quiet, the withdrawal, the relationships that dissolved without confrontation. None of that is chaos. It's a mechanism. A specific, deliberate mechanism with one purpose: clear the ground before something new is planted. Take a breath right now, not a rushed one, the kind that tells your system, I'm still here, I'm paying attention, I'm ready to understand what this actually is. You're not behind, you're not broken, you're not being left out of something that was meant for you. The question isn't why is this happening to me anymore. That question belongs to an older version of this experience. The real question, the one that actually moves you forward, is this. Now that you understand what this mechanism is, what do you do with it? Because a mechanism can only serve you when you stop fighting it and start working with it. That's exactly where we're going. The mechanism has a name now. You know what the pruning is. But knowing the name doesn't automatically dissolve the guilt, and it doesn't silence the voice that still whispers, maybe you're just difficult to be around. Maybe you expect too much. Maybe the problem was never the environment. Maybe the problem was always you. That voice isn't wisdom, it's conditioning. And before we go any deeper into what this season is building, we need to dismantle what installed that voice in the first place. Here's the thing. From the time you were old enough to be evaluated socially, you were handed a very clear equation. More people equals more value. The kid with the full lunch table was thriving. The one who sat quietly at the edge was struggling. The adult with the packed schedule was successful. The one who declined invitations was antisocial, cold, or broken in some way that needed fixing. That equation got repeated so many times in schools, in workplaces, in the way people talk about success, that most people stopped questioning it entirely. They just absorbed it. They built their self-worth on top of it, without ever asking whether it was actually true. Stay with me, because this is where it gets precise. That equation was never designed to account for people who operate at a different frequency. It was built for a certain kind of participation, surface level, high volume, low depth, and it works perfectly for that. But you've never been built for surface. You've always felt the undercurrent of a room before the conversation even started. You've always known when something was off, even when everyone around you was smiling and the metrics said everything was fine. That's not a flaw in your wiring. That's a more sophisticated instrument running in an environment designed for something simpler. Now watch this. When a precision instrument is placed in the wrong environment, it doesn't perform well, not because it's broken, but because it's picking up interference that less sensitive instruments can't even detect. Think about what happens to a high-caliber sound system in a room with terrible acoustics. The problem isn't the equipment. The problem is the space, and the solution isn't to damage the equipment so it stops noticing the interference. The solution is to stop pretending the acoustics are fine. Here's what nobody tells you: the exhaustion you felt in crowded rooms, the heaviness after social gatherings that everyone else seemed to enjoy, that was never a personal failing. That was data. Accurate, consistent, important data that you were trained to dismiss. The matrix, the collective agreement about how connection should look and what it should cost you, has a specific investment in keeping you confused about this. Because a person who understands their own instrument doesn't stay in environments that damage it. They don't apologize for needing different conditions. They don't spend their energy trying to become less sensitive so they can tolerate more noise. And a person like that is harder to manage, harder to guilt, harder to keep in a seat that was never built for them. Think about that. Your confusion has been useful to a system that benefits from your participation. Your clarity is not. Here's where the energy leak actually starts. It doesn't start with the crowded room. It starts with the story you tell yourself in the aftermath. You walk out of an environment that drained you, and instead of processing what the experience was actually telling you, you turn the instrument on yourself. You audit your own behavior. You replay conversations looking for what you did wrong. You try to figure out how to do the next gathering better, how to be more present, more engaged, more like the people who seem to move through those spaces without losing anything. That self-audit is the real leak, not the room, not the people. The story that says you need to fix your response to an environment that was never calibrated for what you carry. Anointed One. Here's the reframe, and I need you to receive this cleanly. The fact that you can't perform sustained shallow connection without cost isn't evidence that you're failing at something. It's evidence that you're operating with a depth that shallow connection can't feed. A garden that's being prepared for something specific can't afford to share its soil nutrients with every passing weed. It isn't being selfish. It isn't being exclusive. It's being faithful to what it was prepared to grow. The guilt you've carried about your need for selectivity, that guilt was never yours to carry. It was handed to you by a framework that doesn't apply to your assignment. So let that weight down. Not all at once if you can't. But start here. The shrinking wasn't your failure. The distance wasn't your deficiency. The discomfort in crowded rooms wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a compass pointing you towards something that the noise was making impossible to hear. You weren't broken in those rooms. You were being redirected. And now that you understand where the lie was planted, we can start building something true in its place. So the lie has been named. You can see now how the Matrix installed a framework that was never built for your frequency, and how that framework turned your most accurate signal into a source of shame. But naming the lie is only the first move. Because there's a version of this conversation that stops here, hands you a permission slip to withdraw from everything, and calls it healing. That's not where we're going. The goal isn't to make peace with absence. The goal is to become someone who manages their space with the same precision that the gardener manages the soil. There's a significant difference between a person who's been emptied out and a person who's learned to steward what they carry. One is a wound, the other is a weapon. Here's the thing. The moment you shift from "this is happening to me" to "I am managing this with intention," everything changes. Not the circumstances. The circumstances may look exactly the same from the outside. The quiet evenings, the reduced invitations, the smaller circle. None of that shifts immediately. What shifts is your relationship to it. And your relationship to it determines whether this season builds something in you or just costs you something. A victim of isolation waits for the season to end. A steward of their own space uses the season to build what the next season will require. Those are two completely different people standing in the same field. Stay with me. Think about what it actually means to steward something. A steward doesn't own the resource, they manage it on behalf of something larger than themselves. They're accountable for how the resource is used, what it's invested in, what it's protected from. When you start treating your energy, your attention, and your access to yourself as resources, you're responsible for, not just preferences, you're entitled to. The whole posture changes. You're no longer defending yourself against a world that doesn't understand you. You're managing an asset that has a specific purpose. And assets with specific purposes require specific conditions. That's not arrogance. That's accountability. Now watch this. The guilt that shows up when you decline an invitation that's not your conscience speaking. That's the old framework running its script. It wants you to believe that every no is a withdrawal from a social contract you owe. But here's what nobody tells you. Not every contract was signed by you. Some of them were signed on your behalf by a version of you that didn't yet understand what you were carrying or where you were going. You're allowed to renegotiate those contracts. You're allowed to look at what you've been agreeing to, the gatherings that drain you, the relationships that only move in one direction, the environments that require you to be less than what you actually are, and say, this agreement no longer reflects what I'm stewarding. Here's the reframe on 3 specific feelings that tend to surface in this season. First, the guilt of saying no. Saying no to an environment that costs you more than it gives isn't abandonment, it's resource management. The soil that's being prepared for a significant harvest can't afford to have its nutrients pulled in 12 directions. It protects what's being cultivated beneath the surface. Second, the strangeness of not needing the crowd. A seed doesn't need a forest to grow. It needs the right soil, the right depth, the right conditions. Your need for fewer but more precise connections isn't a limitation on your capacity. It's evidence that your roots are going somewhere specific. Third, the fear of being forgotten. A field that looks empty in winter isn't dead. It's doing the work that makes summer possible. What's forming in you right now isn't visible yet. That's not absence. That's timing. Anointed one, let me give you something concrete here, because this principle has to move off the page and into your actual decisions. Think about the last time someone asked something of you, your time, your energy, your presence, and you said yes when your whole system was saying no. Not because you wanted to, because you felt the pull of obligation, the fear of being misunderstood, the desire to not be seen as someone who's pulling away. You showed up, and you paid for it afterward, not in hours, but in something harder to recover. That internal depletion isn't a small thing. It compounds. Every time you override the signal to manage an impression, you make a withdrawal from a reserve that your actual assignment needs. The practice isn't perfection. It's not about becoming someone who never shows up for people or never extends beyond comfort. It's about making the decision from the right place, from stewardship, not from guilt, from clarity, not from fear of what someone might think. A person who manages their space well doesn't need to explain their boundaries to everyone. They just maintain them with quiet consistency. That consistency is what the next season is going to require. And the good news is, you've already been practicing it even when it didn't feel like practice. It felt like loss. But it was formation. Now we move into what that formation actually built. You've shifted the frame. You're no longer reading this season as failure, you're reading it as formation. But there's a layer underneath the frame that we haven't opened yet. And it's the one that actually drives the behavior. Because you can understand intellectually that your circle needed to shrink and still find yourself walking out of certain interactions feeling hollowed out without knowing exactly why. The understanding doesn't automatically stop the leak. To stop the leak, you have to find it first. That's what this chapter is for. Here's the thing. Energy doesn't leave you all at once. It doesn't happen in dramatic moments where someone obviously takes from you. It happens in increments. Small, consistent, almost invisible withdrawals that you don't notice until you're sitting alone afterward, wondering why you feel like you ran a marathon when all you did was have a conversation. That's not weakness. That's what happens when you're running a more complex internal process than the people around you realize, and you're running it in environments that were never calibrated to support it. There are 3 specific ways the leak happens, and once you see them, you won't be able to unsee them. The first is forced consensus. This is the most expensive one, and it's also the most socially rewarded. It happens in meetings where a decision is being made that your whole system is registering as wrong, not emotionally, not personally, but at a deeper level of knowing. And instead of naming what you sense, you go quiet. You nod. You perform agreement because the room is moving in one direction and the cost of friction feels too high in that moment. Here's what nobody tells you: the performance itself is the drain. You didn't lie, you didn't say anything harmful, but you spent a significant amount of internal energy maintaining the gap between what you sensed and what you expressed. That gap has a price, and you pay it later alone when you can't figure out why a 2-hour meeting left you needing 3 hours to recover. Stay with me. The second leak is unfiltered absorption. This one is subtler. You walk into a space, an office, a dinner, a group call, and you start picking up what's in the room before anyone has said anything meaningful. Tension between two people who are pretending everything's fine. Anxiety running underneath a confident presentation. Ambition dressed up as collaboration. You don't go looking for this information. It arrives. And if you don't have a conscious practice of filtering what's yours versus what belongs to the room, you carry it home. You process it in your sleep. You wake up the next morning with a weight you can't name because it was never yours to carry in the first place. Think about that. You've been doing emotional labor for rooms that never asked you to and never knew you were doing it. The third leak is the most avoidable once you see it: unnecessary explanation. Every time you sense that a boundary is needed and then spend energy justifying that boundary to someone who wasn't equipped to understand it, you make 2 withdrawals instead of 1. You pay the cost of the interaction, and then you pay the additional cost of trying to make the interaction make sense to someone for whom it never will. Now watch this. The explanation doesn't protect the boundary. It just delays the discomfort while consuming the energy you were trying to preserve. A steward doesn't explain to a weed why the soil isn't available. The soil is simply elsewhere. Here's a tool you can use immediately, what I call the 24-hour check. After any significant social environment, wait 24 hours and ask one honest question. Do I have more or less than I arrived with? Not more or less of a specific resource. More or less of yourself. More clarity, more energy, more sense of direction, or less. The answer doesn't have to mean you never return to that environment, but it tells you what category that environment belongs in, and that categorization should be informing your decisions. Most people never ask the question. They just keep showing up and wondering why they're always running on empty. Anointed one. The leak isn't a character flaw. It's a systems problem. And systems problems have systems solutions. You're not too sensitive. You're not too selective. You're an instrument that's been operating without a maintenance protocol. The exhaustion you felt isn't evidence that you can't handle people. It's evidence that you've been handling the wrong inputs without the right filters in place. The filter is what we build next, and it starts not with who you let in, but with what you let land. You know where the leak is now. You can name the 3 points where energy exits without permission: forced consensus, unfiltered absorption, unnecessary explanation. But knowing the exit points isn't the same as having the capability to close them in real time. Because the moment you're back in a room, back in a conversation, back inside the pressure of an actual situation, understanding evaporates fast. What you need isn't more insight. What you need is a trained response. And that's exactly what discernment is: not a mystical gift distributed to the spiritually elite, not a reward for the especially faithful. A skill developed through repetition, forged in precisely the kind of silence you've been living through. Here's the thing. Most people treat discernment like it's a feeling, something that either shows up or it doesn't, something you're born with or spend your whole life waiting to develop. But that's not how it actually operates. Discernment is pattern recognition, running at a level your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. It's your full system, not just your intellect, but the whole instrument reading data that the surface of a situation isn't advertising. The reason it develops in silence is specific noise doesn't just distract you from the signal. Noise actively mimics the signal. It generates urgency, social pressure, and emotion that feel exactly like intuition, but are pointing you in completely different directions. Silence strips the mimics away. What remains is the real signal, and the more time you spend in that stripped-down environment, the faster you learn to recognize it when the noise returns. Stay with me, because this gets very practical very fast. There are 3 physical markers that appear before your conscious mind has finished processing what's happening, and learning to read them in real time is the core of this skill. The first is body resistance. Before anyone has said anything that should logically concern you, your shoulders have shifted, your breathing has become shallower. Something in your chest has registered a quiet alarm. This isn't generalized anxiety. Anxiety is diffuse. It floats across everything. This is directional. It's pointing at something specific, a particular person in the room, a specific clause in the offer, an undercurrent in the conversation that the words themselves haven't revealed yet. When your body responds before your mind has a reason that's not imagination, that's your instrument doing precisely what it was built to do. The second marker is language delay. It happens in conversation when someone asks you something, not a complicated question, nothing that should require extended deliberation, and you find yourself hesitating in a way that feels disproportionate to the question. Now watch this. That hesitation isn't confusion, it's resistance. Your system has already registered something about where this conversation is heading, and it's creating friction before your intellect has articulated why. Most people override that friction because the pause feels socially uncomfortable. But that pause is data, some of the most accurate data you'll receive in that entire interaction. The next time you feel that disproportionate hesitation, don't fill it immediately. Let it sit for one full breath. What surfaces in that breath is almost always more precise than whatever you were preparing to say to smooth the moment over. The third marker is post-departure clarity. You've lived this more times than you can count. You're inside a meeting, a negotiation, a significant conversation, and you genuinely cannot locate the clear response while you're in it. Everything feels murky. Then you step out into a hallway, into your car, into open air, and within minutes, the answer is completely obvious. So obvious it almost seems like you should have seen it while you were sitting there. Here's what nobody tells you about that experience. It wasn't unclear because you were underprepared. It was unclear because the environment was generating interference that your instrument couldn't filter in real time. The moment you removed yourself from the field, the signal came through without distortion. That's not coincidence. That's your system telling you exactly what conditions it requires to function at its actual capacity. Here's a concrete practice, what I call the 3-second governance pause. Before any significant interaction, any decision that carries real weight, any moment where you feel the pull of social pressure to respond immediately, take 3 full seconds of internal stillness. Not deep breathing, not visualization, just 3 seconds and one question: does this open space or close it? Not whether it's comfortable, not whether it fits what you expected. Whether it opens or closes the territory you're responsible for stewarding. That question asked with consistency recalibrates your entire decision-making process from reactive to intentional. Think about that. 3 seconds. That's not hesitation, that's governance in motion. Anointed One. The silence of this season wasn't emptiness, it was a laboratory. Every quiet morning, every evening without plans, every hour you sat with your own signal without the interference of other people's noise that was active training. You were learning to separate your frequency from the frequencies around you. And that separation, that clean distinction between what's yours and what belongs to the room, is the foundation of everything the gardener is preparing to build through you next. You have the signal now. You know what body resistance feels like. You know what language delay is telling you. You know why post-departure clarity isn't a malfunction, but a measurement. The instrument is identified. The training is named. But there's a gap that still needs to be bridged, the gap between recognizing the signal and actually acting on it in real time, inside real situations, with real social pressure present. Because discernment that stays internal and never translates into a decision is just expensive self-awareness. It costs you the clarity without giving you the relief. What we're building in this chapter is the operational layer, not the philosophy of boundaries, the actual mechanics of how you move. Here's the thing. There are 3 distinct situations where intentional withdrawal gets tested, and each one requires a different application of the same core principle. Getting them confused is where most people stall. They apply a confrontational approach to a situation that needed a quiet fade, or they go silent in a moment that actually required a clean, direct decision. The precision matters. The gardener doesn't use the same tool for every part of the field. Pruning shears aren't shovels. Knowing which situation you're in determines which response actually serves the ground you're protecting. The first situation is the slow drain a relationship that has been pulling more than it's returning for longer than you've been willing to admit. Not a toxic explosion, not a betrayal, just a consistent, quiet imbalance that you keep hoping will correct itself. Stay with me on this one because it's the most common and the most mishandled. The instinct is to either confront it formally, which usually creates drama, the relationship wasn't even worth, or to keep absorbing the imbalance out of loyalty to the history. Neither of those is stewardship. The actual move is what I'd call a graceful reduction. You don't announce it, you don't explain it, you simply stop being the first one to reach out. You stop rearranging your schedule to accommodate. You let the natural rhythm of the relationship reveal whether it can sustain itself when you're no longer overextending to maintain it. Most can't. And the ones that can't were already telling you something important that you weren't ready to hear. The second situation is being inside an environment you can't exit immediately, a work event, a family gathering, a professional obligation you couldn't decline. Now watch this. The mistake here isn't attending. The mistake is attending without an anchor. Before you walk into any space that you know will pull on you, set one internal intention. Not a goal for the room, an intention for yourself. Something like, I'm here to observe, not to absorb. I'm contributing specifically, not generally. I'm present in this room, but not permeable to it. That distinction, present but not permeable, is the whole practice compressed into 4 words. You're not dissociating, you're not performing detachment. You're maintaining the boundary of your own interior while your exterior participates. Think about that. You can be in the room completely and still belong to yourself entirely. The third situation is the incoming request, an invitation, an ask, a commitment someone wants from you that your system is already registering as wrong timing, wrong direction, or wrong cost. And here's what nobody tells you about this one. The length of your explanation is inversely proportional to the clarity of your boundary. The more you explain, the more you signal that the boundary is negotiable, that with the right argument or the right emotional appeal, it might move. A steward who's genuinely managing a resource doesn't deliver a presentation on why the resource isn't available. They simply redirect. "That doesn't work for me right now" is a complete sentence. It doesn't have a missing second half that justifies the first. Let that land. Here's the distinction that holds all three situations together. Intentional withdrawal and avoidance look identical from the outside. Same result. You're not there. You've pulled back. The interaction didn't happen. But they come from completely different places inside you, and they produce completely different outcomes. Avoidance is driven by fear, fear of conflict, fear of disappointment, fear of being misunderstood. It leaves residue, guilt, second-guessing the low hum of unfinished business that follows you into the next situation. Intentional withdrawal is driven by clarity. It's clean. It doesn't require revisiting. You made the call from the right place with the right information in service of the right thing. There's no residue because there's no confusion about why it happened. Anointed one. The gardener doesn't prune in anger or in fear. Every cut is made with complete knowledge of what the branch was consuming and what the tree needs to produce. That same quality of knowing, calm, precise, undefended, is what you're developing every time you act on the signal instead of overriding it. You're not closing yourself off. You're learning to open correctly. You've built the operational layer. You know how to read the signal, you know how to act on it, and you know the difference between intentional withdrawal and avoidance. That's not small work. Most people spend years in this season without ever developing that level of precision. But now we move into the territory that this entire foundation was built to support, because the skills you've been developing in private don't stay private. They translate, they show up in rooms, they register in negotiations, they produce outcomes that people around you will notice before they can explain what they're noticing. This chapter is about that translation, how the internal order you've been building becomes a form of authority that operates completely differently from anything the Matrix taught you authority should look like. Here's the thing. The world gave you one primary model for authority: volume. The loudest voice in the room, the most confident presentation, the person who takes up the most space and speaks with the least hesitation. That model works in certain environments, but it has a ceiling, and the ceiling is lower than it appears, because volume-based authority requires constant maintenance. It needs the room's attention to sustain itself. The moment the room shifts, the moment the audience changes, the moment someone isn't performing their agreement, the authority flickers. It was never self-sustaining. It was always dependent on external input to stay lit. What you've been building is different. It doesn't require the room's participation to exist. Stay with me. When a person has spent a significant season learning to operate from internal clarity, making decisions without needing consensus, maintaining direction without needing applause, holding their position without needing to explain it, something settles in them that becomes structurally visible, not in what they say, in how they occupy space. There's a quality of presence that doesn't scan the room for permission. It doesn't adjust its posture based on who just walked in. It doesn't get louder when challenged or quieter when overlooked. It simply remains. And that quality, that unmistakable stillness at the center of a person, is one of the most powerful signals a room can receive. Now watch this. Think about the last high-stakes situation you were in: a negotiation, a difficult conversation, a moment where the outcome actually mattered. The person who held the most real authority in that room almost certainly wasn't the one performing confidence the loudest. It was the one who seemed least moved by the pressure, the one who could sit inside a silence without needing to fill it, the one whose next move you couldn't predict because they weren't reacting, they were responding from somewhere you couldn't access. Think about that. Unpredictability born from stillness isn't a strategy you perform. It's a byproduct of being genuinely anchored. You can't fake it convincingly, but you can build it, and you have been. Here's what nobody tells you about how this plays out practically. In a negotiation, the person who needs the outcome most makes the most concessions. Not because they're less skilled, because their need is visible, and visibility in that context is leverage handed to the other side. A person who has trained themselves through a season of silence to need nothing from the room, not validation, not agreement, not even resolution within a specific timeline, enters that negotiation with a structural advantage that no preparation course teaches. They can wait. They're not performing patience. They genuinely aren't moved by the pressure to resolve quickly. And the other side feels that. They can't name it, but they feel it. That feeling changes the entire dynamic. The same principle applies in spaces of influence and leadership. People don't follow volume over time. They follow groundedness. They follow the person who seems to know something they haven't said yet, who listens in a way that makes you feel accurately heard rather than just processed, who makes decisions that don't seem to originate from the pressures everyone else is visibly responding to. That quality isn't charisma, it's calibration. It's what happens when a person has spent enough time with their own signal that they're no longer easily hijacked by the signals in the room. Anointed one. Here's the direct line. The silence wasn't just spiritual formation. It was professional preparation. Every morning you sat with your own clarity. Instead of filling the space with noise, you were building capital. Not the kind that shows up in an account, the kind that shows up in a room. The kind that makes people lean in when you finally speak. The kind that makes your yes mean something specific and your no mean something final. The gardener was never just preparing your soul. The gardener was preparing your presence. And presence, when it's genuinely grounded, is the beginning of everything that comes next. You've seen how internal order translates into authority. You've seen how the groundedness built in silence becomes a structural advantage in rooms, in negotiations, in spaces of influence. Now we move into the dimension that most conversations about spiritual formation deliberately avoid because it feels too practical, too material, too far from the language of calling and purpose. But here's the thing, if the formation is real, it has to show up in your finances, not as a reward delivered from above, as a consequence of structure. Because money follows the same principle as everything else we've been building. It doesn't stay in a container that's still leaking. Stay with me, because this requires a specific kind of honesty. The prosperity framework told you that blessing follows faith, that overflow follows prayer, that if you believe correctly, the resources will come. That framework isn't entirely wrong, but it's dangerously incomplete, because it skips the middle step. The middle step is structure. Heaven doesn't withhold provision from people who haven't earned it spiritually. Heaven entrusts resources to structures that can steward them without losing them immediately. That's not theology, that's mechanics. You don't pour water into a cracked vessel because you're withholding water. You wait because the water will be gone before it's useful. Now watch this. Think about every financial decision you've made from the wrong internal place, not the wrong information, the wrong place. The investment you entered because everyone in your circle was entering it, and you didn't want to be the one who missed it. The business arrangement you maintained past its season because confronting it felt more expensive than absorbing the cost. The money you spent trying to occupy a position in rooms that were never actually yours, to be in the right clothes, the right appearances, the right signals to the wrong audience. None of those decisions were made from clarity. They were made from the same force that drives every other leak, the need to manage how you appear to people whose opinion of you was never part of your actual assignment. Here's what nobody tells you about the connection between social boundaries and financial outcomes. Every time you override your signal to manage a social impression, you're making a financial decision. Maybe not immediately, maybe not visibly, but you're allocating resources based on external pressure rather than internal discernment. And those allocations compound. The relationship you kept past its season because you didn't want the discomfort of releasing it, that relationship had a financial cost you may have never formally calculated. The time redirected, the decisions deferred, the energy consumed processing dynamics that your instrument had already flagged as misaligned. Time and energy aren't separate from money. They're the upstream resource that money flows from. Think about that. 3 specific leaks that show up directly in the financial layer. The first is consensus-driven investment, committing resources to something not because your discernment confirmed it, but because the social pressure of the room made saying no feel like a statement about your faith, your ambition, or your willingness to take risks. The second is loyalty. Past season, maintaining financial relationships, partnerships, or arrangements out of history rather than current alignment. The history is real. The loyalty may be genuine, but a structure that's no longer serving the direction you're moving in doesn't become useful again because you feel guilty about releasing it. The third is visibility spending, allocating resources to maintain a presence in spaces that your signal has already told you aren't the right territory. You're not investing in your assignment. You're managing an impression for an audience that isn't connected to where you're actually going. Here's the governance practice for this layer. Once a quarter, not once a year, once a quarter, ask 3 questions about every significant financial commitment you're currently carrying. First, is this aligned with where I'm actually going or with where I thought I was going when I made this commitment? Second, am I maintaining this because my discernment says it's still right, or because releasing it feels socially complicated? Third, if I were making this decision today, with everything I currently know about my direction and what I'm carrying, would I make the same choice? The answers to those 3 questions, asked honestly, will tell you more about where your financial structure is leaking than any budget review. Anointed 1. The gardener prepares the soil before the seed goes in, not after. The preparation isn't a spiritual formality before the real work begins. The preparation is the work. What you've been building in this season, the boundaries, the discernment, the ability to act from clarity instead of pressure, that's the soil preparation. Financial increase planted into an unprepared structure doesn't multiply, it disperses. But increase that enters a structure that's been cleared, ordered, and governed, that has somewhere to go. That has something to grow into. The structure comes first, always, and yours is being built right now, one clean decision at a time. The structure is being prepared, the soil has been cleared, the leaks have been identified, and the governance practices are in place. And now something begins to shift, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with a quiet, unmistakable momentum. Doors that were closed start to open. Invitations that carry real weight begin to arrive. Opportunities appear that are actually aligned with where you're going rather than where you've been. This is the moment most people have been waiting for. And it's also the moment where everything built in the quiet is most at risk. Because re-entry has its own specific danger, and if you don't understand what that danger is before you step back into visibility, the season you just survived will only have been preparation for a more expensive mistake. Here's the thing: the testing doesn't stop when the breakthrough arrives. It intensifies. The wilderness season tests your faithfulness when nothing is moving. The visibility season tests your structure when everything starts moving at once. And the failure mode in visibility looks completely different from the failure mode in silence. In silence, you fail by giving up too early, by misreading the season as abandonment and walking away from what was being built. In visibility, you fail by reverting, by letting the momentum of new access pull you back into the patterns that the quiet season was specifically designed to clear. The expanded calendar, the yes to every room, the slow erosion of the boundaries that cost you so much to establish. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small concessions that each feel reasonable in isolation until you look up 6 months later and realize you're running the same leak you spent an entire season repairing. Stay with me. There are two completely different ways to walk into a room, and the difference between them determines everything about what you bring out. The first way is entering to be confirmed. Your body is in the room, but your attention is on the room's response to your body. You're reading faces. You're adjusting your energy based on what you're receiving back. You're performing a version of yourself calibrated to what this particular audience seems to want from you. It feels like engagement. It's actually surveillance. And surveillance is exhausting because it never ends. There's always another signal to read, another adjustment, to make another version of yourself to maintain. The second way is entering already positioned. You know why you're in this room before you arrive. You know what you're bringing and what you're not available for. You know what a successful interaction looks like from your side, not theirs. The room doesn't define the terms of your presence. You arrived with terms already set. Now watch this. The way you establish that second posture isn't through confidence as the world defines it. It isn't about how you carry yourself physically or how fluently you speak. It's about having done one specific piece of work before you walked in, identifying what you won't do in this space. Not what you'll achieve, what you won't concede. 1 or 2 clear internal commitments. I won't override my signal to smooth this interaction. I won't commit to anything that requires me to decide under pressure. And suddenly, the room has significantly less power over your behavior than it did when you arrived without that preparation. Think about that. The boundary set before entry doesn't need to be enforced in the moment. It's already governing the moment before it begins. Here's what nobody tells you about influence at this level. The people in rooms who carry the most weight are almost never the ones working the hardest to be felt. They're the ones who seem genuinely unattached to a specific outcome, not indifferent unattached. There's a precision in how they listen that tells you they're actually processing what you're saying rather than preparing their response while you're still talking. There's a quality in how they decline that doesn't feel like rejection, it feels like clarity. And there's something in how they move through a space that suggests the space didn't change them upon entry, they brought their own weather. That quality isn't performed and it isn't accidental. It's the direct output of a person who has spent significant time learning what their instrument requires and protecting those requirements even when the social cost of protection was high. The final practice of this season, and it's non-negotiable, is the return ritual. After every significant interaction, every high-stakes room, every moment where the external pressure was real and present, 15 minutes completely alone before you process anything with anyone. Not to debrief, not to analyze, simply to return to yourself. To let what was the room's frequency dissipate and feel what's actually yours again. Anointed one, you weren't built for the crowd, you were built for precision. And precision requires knowing the difference between what you walked in with and what the room tried to hand you on the way out. Protect the return every single time. You've made it to the end of this. Not the end of the season, the end of the confusion about what the season was for. And those are two very different things. The season may still be present. The quiet may still be your primary environment. The circle may still be smaller than the world says it should be, but you're no longer standing in it without understanding. You know what the pruning is. You know why the leak happened and where it exits. You know the difference between a boundary set from fear and a boundary held from clarity. You know how to enter a room already positioned and leave it still belonging to yourself. That knowledge isn't small. It's the difference between a person being shaped by their circumstances and a person who has learned to govern them. Here's the thing. Everything built in silence has a moment where it gets tested by visibility, not destroyed by it tested. The testing isn't punishment for surviving the quiet season. It's the natural pressure that comes when what was formed in private begins to operate in public. And the single most important thing you can carry into that testing isn't a strategy or a framework or a list of practices. It's this: remember what the ground cost. Remember what it took to clear it. Remember the specific weight of the season where you learned to act on the signal instead of overriding it. That memory is a safeguard, not the sentimental kind, the structural kind. It tells you clearly and immediately when something is pulling you back toward a pattern that cost you too much to repeat. Stay with me for just a moment longer. There are 3 things you don't carry forward from here. The first is the guilt of the boundaries you held. Every relationship that faded because you stopped overextending to maintain it. Every invitation you declined because your system said no. Every room you left early because the cost was registering before the benefit arrived. None of that requires an apology. You weren't withholding, you were stewarding. The gardener doesn't apologize for the pruning. The gardener protects the harvest. The second thing you don't carry forward is the story that the quiet season was lost time. It wasn't lost. It was the most productive period of your formation. You just couldn't see the growth because it was happening underground in the root system, in the parts of you that don't photograph well but hold everything else up. The third is the need to explain your positioning to people who weren't part of building it. Your authority doesn't require their understanding to function. Let it speak for itself. Now watch this. The season ahead won't ask you to become someone new. It's going to ask you to remain who you became in the quiet inside environments that will apply real pressure to that identity. More access, more opportunity, more people in the room who want something from what you carry. The temptation will be to expand your availability in proportion to the expansion of your opportunity. Resist that. Availability and impact are not the same metric. The most consequential people in any field are almost never the most accessible ones. They're the most intentional ones. Intentionality maintained under pressure is the final form of everything this season built. Anointed one. Here's the last thing. The ground has been prepared. The soil has been cleared, ordered, and governed. What gets planted in it from here, the relationships, the resources, the responsibilities, will grow in proportion to how faithfully you protect the conditions that made growth possible in the first place. Not with rigidity, not with fear. With the same quiet, precise, undefended clarity that you've been building since the season began. The gardener didn't prepare this ground to leave it empty. What comes next is already in motion. Your only assignment is to remain who you became when no one was watching, now that everyone is beginning to. If something in this conversation landed in a place that already knew it was true before the words arrived, you don't need to do anything with that except honor it. If you're led to mark this moment, leave a quiet word below. Not for the algorithm, for the others moving through the same season who need to know they're not alone in the field. And if someone in your life is in the middle of this exact pruning right now, send this to them without explanation. They'll know why it arrived.